I'm Tonja Opperman. I'm a wildland fire analyst. I live in Gardner, Montana, and I work for the Wildland Fire Management RDNA. And our mission is basically to help fire managers make better decisions on fires, make decisions that they feel like they're supported in the decisions that they're making. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about the tools that we use. I'm going to be just skimming the surface of the tools because I know we have a pretty diverse audience here. First of all, I just wanted to mention the guidance that guides the use of fire. You know, we don't use the term fire use anymore, but we still utilize fire, obviously, and we can manage for more than one objective on different flanks of the fire at different times as that fire moves over space and time. And we have a flow chart in the 09 guidance that guides how we manage fire. And if you want to take a deep dive into policy, I did make a handout of all of the ways that we have changed the way we manage fire in the United States, basically since the Wilderness Act. And I think it's really interesting. So how many of you remember the EFSA? All right, how many of the WFSA? So these were terms, the EFSA, Escape Fire Situation Analysis, and Wildland Fire Situation Analysis, were tools that we used up until about 2008, where we were required to look at alternatives when we managed fires. So the EFSA, you had to look at 3 suppression alternatives. The WFSA, you were allowed to look at non-suppression alternatives. But nevertheless, you had to come up with 3 alternatives. And it's a good idea because we should always look at alternatives when we manage fires, right? But it kind of became a paperwork exercise where you had to come up with 2 alternatives that were dummies so that you could pick the one that you really knew you wanted to do. And I think then when Zimmerman and Bunnell rewrote some of the guidance, you know, we kind of got rid of the need to do alternatives, and we moved into this idea of just looking at a deliberative risk analysis. And that's a concept that's used, you know, for risk analysis for growing grapes for wine or for saving fuel on truck driving or whatever. But what it is if we look at the brown arrow here, you formulate your problem, you gather information, you do an analysis, you synthesize, you make a decision, you document the decision, and then you go back on the green arrow with evaluation and lessons learned and feedback, and you start over again. And all the while, these little circles here are where you're meeting with stakeholders or your FMO or your agency line officer, and you are continually informing the process as you go. So the way that was translated into WFDIS in 2009, because the 2009 guidance said, now we're not going to use WFSA anymore, we're going to use WFDIS for our decision support. The Wildland Fire Decision Support System basically has these tabs across the bottom, and these tabs, or across the top of the page, that relate exactly to this process. So using WFDIS is a deliberative risk analysis process. So you gather information, you have a situation map, you do an assessment where you run fire models, you develop your objectives and your course of action, you make a decision, you document it, and then you do a periodic assessment to see how you're doing, and you go back and start all over again. So let's just look briefly at some of the WFDIS-based tools. And those of you who are operational fire managers today, you probably are familiar with a lot of these. But the first thing I wanted to talk about was the planning area. So the planning area is where you draw a polygon in WFDIS that helps you understand where your fire is going to go maybe in the next 7 days, your planning horizon. Next 7 days, next 14 days. It is not an MMA. It's not a maximum manageable area. It doesn't mean you're going to contain the fire there. It doesn't even have to be drawn on any kind of feature on the landscape that you can identify. You can just draw a box. I'm a big fan of the box. It's easy. And the only purpose of this is for you to identify where the values are in your landscape so that you don't get caught unaware as your fire grows. It's just a way for you to gut check, oh, there is some TNC land over here. Oh, there is some bull trout land over here. This fire, they drew the planning area, and sorry to call anyone out, but they drew the planning area right along the private land boundary and the Forest Service boundary because they didn't want to pull in all the wooey because that would look like it's a really bad fire. And they didn't want the fire. But what happens is WFDIS automatically pulls up all your values. So the values here don't show much wooey, it shows 4 houses. And really, they are taking a lot of action here because they had a real threat. And so I always think it's a good idea for you to draw a bigger box, pull in all those values and then demonstrate why you're taking the actions you're taking on your fire. That's what WIFDIS is there to help you to do. Now, if you haven't been in WIFDIS for a while, I think you should ask someone on your local unit to maybe do a walkthrough with you, because there are a lot of features in there that you can update annually or you can customize for your unit. So for example here, this is from the Southwest, but here they have Mexican spotted owl packs. They're these little pink polygons. And they've uploaded those for their unit, so when they have a fire and they run fire behavior, they can see exactly how the packs are impacted by fires, whether it's just fire spread or fire intensity or whatever. But that's important to their decision making, and so they upload it into the system. And you can do that too. You just have to ask your local unit to do that. Long-term management action points. We used to do LTIPs, right? Does everyone, or I guess those of us that have been in fire for a little while, long-term implementation plans were like these 50 to 75 page Word documents. You would have like 5 analysts in a room pounding on their computers to create these big plans. And now you just do it right in the system. So you just draw your management action point, which is the brown lines on here. You draw a line in the sand and you say, well, if the fire breaches the line, then we're going to do this. Then we're going to notify the community of pre-evacuation, or then we're going to notify the folks that the bull trout habitat might get affected in the next 72 hours, or then we're going to start looking at smoke because it means our fire got bigger. So whatever you need to do for management action points to box your fire in and have a plan, you just do it kind of on the fly with this now. And every time you draw one of those lines, you have to fill out this little box that just says, this is what we're going to do, this is when we're going to do it, this is why we're going to do it, and these are the people we're going to use to do it, and this is how much it'll cost. And then as your fire grows, which is the red polygons, your fire breaches the lines, and then you put your actions into place. Another tool that's in WIFDIS is the firefighter evacuation layer. And we've talked a lot about firefighter safety and firefighter exposure. I think there's been a lot more talk lately about reducing firefighter exposure. And this layer is available in WIFDIS for the CONUS, for the lower 48. It's wall to wall, it's all lands, and it tells us if it's red that it's more than 6 hours to transport an injured firefighter to a care facility. And if it's green, it's 1 to 2 hours to transport a firefighter. And why this would be important is not to necessarily drive your final strategic decision on a fire, but I think it should be used more often. I don't think people know that it's in the system, but I think we should use it more often to start conversations. So if you're the AA on a fire, the agency administrator, I think you should look at where your fire is and then have a conversation about whether or not you want to follow through with the strategy that's being recommended. And I think if you're the firefighter, you should be doing the same thing and say, well, why are you asking me to go out there if the map is all red? You know, can we come up with a different alternative or a different strategy? So just so you know, that's in there. Spatial fire behavior, that's available in WIFDIS. It's really easy to run now. So in the past, Dick Rothermel, you know, he was the father of the current wildfire spread equation that we use, and we have pictures of him coming out to Yellowstone and running our fire behavior for us, you know, with like paper and pencil and calculator. And that's how we used to do fire behavior, right? And then we got the fire calculators that we carried in the field, and then we had Behave, which did tabular outputs of flame length and rates of spread and things like that. And now we have a program where you just log in and it pulls in your landscape file with all your topography and fuels. It pulls in your weather station with all of your past 7 days of weather and your forecast, and pulls in your ignition, and you just hit the button basically, and it outputs, like, for example, here, your flame length, and it outputs it wall to wall across the whole landscape, so you can see, you know, the red where you're going to have problems with higher flame lengths, like if you're a division or if you're an F-band and you're trying to look at different types of fire behavior across a huge fire. You know, you don't have to be running Behave on every single flank. You can run basic, and there you have an outlook for your fire for the next day, or for a cold frontal passage, or for whatever you want to look at. But it's really way easier now than it used to be. So I know this map looks like a mess, but that's the nature of some of the big fires we manage. It doesn't necessarily look like this for wilderness, but I wanted to show what the capability is in the system to look at really complex situations. So this is an FS Pro run. The colors you see on the map, the rainbow, that's a fire spread probability analysis. So what it does is it takes a fire and it runs it out for 7 days under one scenario for weather and wind. And then it rolls the dice and runs it again, and rolls the dice and rolls the dice, and it does that 2,000 to 5,000 times and gives us a probability surface. So where it's red here, that has an 80% chance of burning in the next 7 days. As you go out, the probability is less. And then all these little icons, these lines and these polygons, those are all values. They're campgrounds, they're structures, they're power lines, they're oil and gas lines, all the kinds of things that you might be worried about if you're managing fire. So what you can see is, for example, here, maybe the breach of the power line is most likely in this area. Maybe that's where you need to focus more of your effort, more of your mitigation. So that's what we use this kind of map for. This is used a lot in wilderness fires, obviously, to see where they might pooch out of the wilderness. Fire history maps. We used to, have to find the GIS specialist on a Sunday afternoon and figure out how to make a map, ask them what we needed, try to explain it when we're not GIS people, and they'd have to make one, a BAM for us. And now you just go into WFDS and all of your layers are right there. You just turn them on and off. You turn on all your fuels treatments that come out of the FACTS database. And I know it looks like a mess right there, but when you zoom into an area of interest when you're modeling a fire, you can really see what kinds of fires have happened there recently, or what kind of fire spread patterns you might see on your landscape that you might be concerned about. Like if you were modeling fire here and you see how all the shapes of these fires are, obviously if you were going down to the Gila and you hadn't been there before, this kind of information is really helpful. Relative risk assessment. Everyone in here, I'm sure, if you've been on fire or doing a decision recently, you filled out what we call a Zimogram. And so I don't want to explain necessarily how to fill that out, but I wanted to say that I see people fill out a relative risk assessment, so is your risk high or moderate or low for your fire, but I see people fill it out just one time, and then they just move on. And the risk is relative. So you need more than one data point to make it relative. And I would really encourage us as fire managers to go into WFDS and use this process as a gut check to make sure that the decision that's been published is still valid. If you're doing the relative risk and you're seeing things on there change and you're still following the same plan you've been following, maybe it's time to have a conversation about strategy or tactics or something on your fire. So your decision, when it's published, it sits over here with a nice little bow on it, and your relative risk sits over here. And you can change your relative risk assessment every single day, every single hour, however often you want, and it doesn't affect your decision. That's why that tool is there, because that tool tells you to go back and change your decision on your fire, or to think about your decision on your fire. So just keep that in mind. And now I want to transition to the non-WFDS tools. If you get an LTAN on your fire, which is a long-term analyst, which is mostly what I do on fires, and I know there's several of you in the room who've done this in your careers as well, but you get on a fire and you look at things like temperature probability outlooks from the Weather Service, you do wind analysis, you open up a Fire Family Plus database and pull in a whole bunch of raw station weather and get 1,000-hour fuel moistures, herbaceous fuel moistures, you look at trends, you try to find out, are we in a really dry season, or is it a wet season, or what is this looking like? You also do a season-ending event analysis to say, well, how long is this fire going to persist on the landscape? Am I looking at a fire till October 1st, or is this going to be November 30th, or what? That's the kind of tools that we see all the time on fires, but that aren't automated yet. So you still need to find some expertise to use those. Now, some new landscape approaches that aren't automated and they're not standardized and they can be hard to come by, but they're out there, and I think you're going to see them more and more as they've been prototyped. This wildfire risk assessment framework, which was published by Joe Scott a few years ago, that's a landscape scale risk assessment that's basically telling us not only is fire good or bad, but how good is it, or how bad might it be? How threatened are our values, and where can we find opportunities on the landscape to use fire? So you'll see more and more of these maps used in an operational context, I think, in the coming decade. The other one someone mentioned earlier, those are the pods, and those are being prototyped right now on the Tonto National Forest. And it's a way to look at fire watersheds as containers for fires, and ways to sort of pre-decide a little bit how you can manage a fire without having to go in and take action if you don't need to. And I don't have more time to talk about it here, but you will be seeing more pods, I think, on fires if you travel around the country and manage big fires. Another tool that's being used is this susceptibility and severity analysis. So if you don't have the Joe Scott whiz-bang $50,000 contract landscape scale risk assessment, when you get to a fire, you can put something like this together to at least help you prioritize assets and reduce damage to the things that are being threatened. And the way this works is you ask the agency administrator, tell me what your values are or your highly valued assets. So for example, here we've got bull trout habitat, we've got the Lincoln Gulch Historic Cemetery, and we've got timber values. And then we ask the agency administrator or geologists, well, how are those things susceptible to fire? So bull trout habitat can sustain surface fire and passive crown fire. Awesome. We don't have to go do anything if that's the predicted fire behavior for the next 2 weeks or the next few operational periods. Lincoln Gulch Cemetery, fire is not desirable in any context. So if fire is going to get there in that FS Pro run, we better be ready to take some mitigated actions there. Timber values, in this case, surface fire is acceptable. So we don't need to go in and expose people or spend money or do things like that if fire behavior is going to be predicted to be surface fire and the agency administrator thinks it's acceptable. So it's a way to look at our highly valued resources and assets without just saying, well, we don't want fire or we do want fire. It's a way to sort of tease out some of the finer points of utilizing fire. Oops. So since this workshop was about the future, I put together some thoughts on what we might see in the future, and we've talked about this a little bit already, but catalysts for change. If you look at that list of policy over time, you'll see that every major policy change in federal wildland fire management was precipitated by a major event. So it was either the 88 Canyon Creek fires, it was the 1994 fatalities on Storm King Mountain, which were the most fatalities on a single incident since 1954. That really captured the public's attention. And then we had the fires of 2000 and the Cerro Grande escape that precipitated a change right after that. So now we've had the 2018 Camp Fire. What's going to happen? I mean, the Dingle Act, if you haven't read it, you should look at it. It's got a lot of things in there that the Forest Service is going to have to respond to. Future tools. Are we going to see AI and automated fire analysis? Is MODIS going to detect your fire, pull it into the system, grab some weather, run fire behavior, suggest a strategy for you? I mean, that could happen. People are talking about that in the Forest Service. Are we going to have trade-off analysis come back again? We got rid of it because we thought we were making dummy scenarios, but people are talking about bringing back a trade-off analysis or maybe using the PACE model as a way to think about a trade-off. So PACE is where you have a primary line around your fire and an alternative and a contingency and an emergency. And is that a way to do trade-off analysis? Processes like the decision criteria checklist, I really liked that checklist. I'm sorry we got rid of it. I wonder if it might come back. There's an AA task book that's coming out this year. It's being prototyped. For those of you that are agency administrators, you're going to have to do tasks in the task book, I think starting this following summer. And one thing we haven't talked a lot about is workforce. The younger generation doesn't want to work 16-hour days out at Dixie Creek or Dixie Ranger Station, like a lot of us did when we were young ground pounders. And how does that affect the way we grow our next generation of firefighters? I think we should probably talk more about that as an agency. And the question about is it easier now or later? Technology and analytics are getting better, and they're improving over time. But politics, Sean Lagarza just testified on the Hill, that's a big deal. And the lack of fire use teams, I know despite Frankie's graph, I really feel like we need people who have that passion and personal commitment to well-end fire use, and that idea has dissolved. No longer can you be part of a team like that. You have to try to insert yourself constantly into suppression teams to further fire use. And finally, I'm on my last slides. If you still have questions, there's always feedback and help in the WIFDIS system. There's a phone number with that phone that Aaron and I will answer 24/7, 365. There's a decision support tab in our webpage. And then I did put together, like I said, these handouts that just, if you're a manager, you can keep these handy with decision support tools.